In this video, you're going to add the sourcing functionality by size and by last modified. So far, you managed to do that successfully for the name header, and now let's do that for these two. So what we would like to do, we would like to reuse the existing code without having to duplicate too much code or write too much new code. So if you look at this function, for example, you would like to set some parameters which will correspond to name, size, or last modified, and then we will be able to write the same code using those parameters. So let's have a quick look at our code at the moment and see where we find that we are referring to name. So the ID here of the events.target property is name. And also we are using the sort name function, which will depend on the name type. And the sort status is also depending on the name. So let's find a way to change all these using a parameter which could be size or time. So let's start with the ID. Now we know that the ID of size is size and the ID of the header last modified is time. And the ID of this header is name anyway. So why not use this inside our code? Let's try that. So for example, when you write sort status.name, you can change that to sort status brackets name, right? And you can use the ID right there. And this will work perfectly. And if you try your code like this, it's working as expected. And we can change this one as well. And that's one. So let's try our code and make sure that everything is still working. That's great. Now in our code, there is something else which depends on the name type, and that's the function sort name. So let's have a look at how this function is built and see if we can change it so that name is just a parameter in the function. So that's our function. And when we are sorting the elements, we used this function right there, and we select the name right there. Now, what if we call our function sort and we add the name as a parameter, like that? Now, we will need to put this code inside an if statement, right? So let's do that. So if type equals name. Now the other two types could be size or time. And the function we're going to be writing for those types is very similar to this one actually. So the only difference is that the size and time, they are using numbers, while the name uses a string, and that's why we've got a to uppercase here. But these lines would be more or less the same. So what we can do, we can change name 1 and name 2 to value 1 and value 2. Like this. change this to equal values instead of names, and use these lines for all scenarios. Like that. And then we're going to have else statements here for the other types. So if the type is size, and else obviously is going to be time if it's not name and size. So in this scenario, instead of item1.name, you're going to use item1.size. And also you need to be careful with scoping here, because value1 has got a block scope here. So let's define these variables outside like this, and just change the values inside. So here we're going to have size, and here as well. And the same thing will apply to the time. So time and time. Now let's go back to our event listeners and change source name to source and just add name at the end, like that. And the same thing applies there. And since name is the same as the ID, let's use this instead. And by the way, to avoid using this extra variable status, I was supposed to use an else if statement instead. So let's do that here. So we don't need that variable. And we can just set the property of sort status inside the if statement. Like that. So now we don't need this condition anymore, since we are using this variable or the value of that property ID. So let's copy all the code that we've got inside and just delete that. Now there is one more thing to change before we test our code, and that's the sort status object. So at the very beginning, we're going to have none for the size and none for the time. And they all have the same possible values, none, up and down. All right, now let's test our code and make sure that everything is okay. So let's try to sort by name. That's working. By size. That's working as well. And by time. Perfect.